I was getting conflicting indications as to whether the audio was recording, so I decided to just make that other video final to make sure that it was recording. It was, so here we go on with chapter 6. Any slide that says the fundamental question is probably important. So understanding this idea, which I illustrated several times in class, that the big issue is, are these two entities better together, meaning they would make more money than they would separate, or sometimes called the better off test. And so if different parts of a company aren't better together, then they should be split off into separate companies. And we also talked about that magic word synergy, where 1 plus 1 equals 3. So I want you to be obviously familiar with the search for pirate treasure. The key thing to understand is the economies of scope that comes through sharing, whether it's activities or core competencies, market power, and then in unrelated diversifications, these sorts of things. What you're really going to be asked on the exam is to recognize what kind of diversification is underway, and how does that matter. So this idea of having the economies of scope, understanding that it's synergy and core competencies, corporate relatedness, or sharing of activities, operational relatedness. I tried to keep these words out of the exam, but they did filter in there. So remember, related constrained diversification is where you're sharing operations, but not so much the core competencies. Whereas if you're related linked, you're sharing competencies, not so much activities. But in closely related businesses, obviously you'd be sharing both. Sharing neither, well, that's down here in unrelated diversification. And you're going to see lots of questions that are going to get around that. Don't need to worry about these specific examples. I hope that you understood it. I hope that you understand market power, and then the concept of vertical integration is important. If you go to buy who you normally sell to, that would be forward integration. If you go backwards and buy a supplier, that would be backward integration. But this whole idea of vertical integration and knowing what's going on, is it something where are we searching for, well, basically, you're just going to have to be clear on that. In unrelated diversification, what you don't see is a lot of um, sharing of anything. But what you do see are these sorts of issues. And then lastly, that you need to worry about, well, I'll get into that later. Okay, so for chapter 6, that wraps it up. Onto the chapter about mergers and acquisitions. You're going to want to be familiar with these terms, mergers, and also why mergers are relatively infrequent. These two terms are just going to help you as you approach the different questions. The terms consolidation, extension, and entrepreneurship are things I expect you to know, even though they're not in the textbook. Um, so be familiar with them. Then be very familiar with these sorts of concepts: what's horizontal, what's vertical, uh, the degree of relatedness, and how those sorts of things tend to become more profitable. The textbook has a excellent discussion on the effect of M&As on innovation, both pro and con. So that's something that you're going to want to be very familiar with. Also, this idea of why you add products and why it might be good to do it from an M&A versus organic development. No real particular specific questions on the idea of M&A and entrepreneurship in terms of understanding this sort of stuff. The process is important, especially you need to recall what's done in the due diligence phase. And then thinking about this slide, make sure you understand why M&As don't work very well. This will help you pick out the right answers to a question or two. This textbook chart, I won't tell you there's any specific questions out of it, but if you're familiar with this, I think you'll be comfortable with material, and it's likely to help you just answer questions correctly, even if you can't recall exactly the answer. And then remember, be familiar with the opposite of M&As, which is downsizing, downscoping, and LBOs. So what types of companies are likely to be most primed for some sort of restructuring action? Okay, that's it for the chapter on M&As. Into chapter 8, our international chapter. It's going to be important that you know the difference between the global strategy, a transnational strategy, and a multi-domestic strategy. And if you're just familiar with what's on the slides, these sorts of slides and the guiding principles, I think you'll be very comfortable with those. Also, very important that you're familiar with all of the entry strategies. So if I were you, I would go and reread the section on entry strategies just to make sure you're familiar with the pros and cons of exporting, licensing, franchising, a strategic alliance, an acquisition, and a greenfield venture. Also, pay attention to the risks. This idea of liability of foreignness is important, the political risk, and the economic risk. Also, very important that you understand whether a strong US dollar hurts or helps US manufacturers that export goods. And you could take the word US out and just say a strong home country dollar, wherever that company is headquartered or where it's producing its goods and their currency. Okay, so again, if you're kind of familiar with these sorts of concepts, I think you'll do quite well on these questions. Last up is alliances. Understanding these basic things will probably help you get the questions right, but there's no specific questions on them, nor is there a specific question on these sorts of things. This idea is important. Why, in what ways are strategic alliances perhaps superior to an M&A if they're trying to accomplish the same thing? Also, being familiar with the type, be knowledgeable of the types of different alliances and how you can spot them. And remember that we said that a contracting sort of deal, even a contract sort of relationship, supplier relationship, would be considered a type of strategic alliance. That would be a non-equity strategic alliance as well. Nothing off of this chart. Make sure you understand the terminology of these sorts of strategies. So I would reread that part of the book so that you're very comfortable with that. Nothing there, nothing specifically there. This is not something you need to worry about for the exam. Told you what not to worry about there. And then pay particular attention to the slides of what are the risks in alliances and how you deal with the risks to the alliances. Also, remember the idea of cost minimization. This is where you build a really detailed contract where everything is specified versus opportunity maximization, where it's not nearly as detailed because you are trying to create the opportunity to do bigger and better things. Also, if you remember, to me, one of the most important questions to ask yourself is, what do they want out of the alliance, and are you good with that? Okay, that, I believe, is everything I want to cover with you for the review. Remember, 40 questions, 50 minutes to complete them. It'll be large. See you then.